Thank you, Janet, for that introduction. Thank you to the college, and in particular, President Joy, for the opportunity to present today. It's a privilege. No conflicts to declare, other than the fact that you heard I just wrote a book entitled The 1 Minute Workout, which I think, depending on your perspective, is just a lot of hype. Perhaps it's helped a few people, and maybe for a few others it offers a little bit of hope. And so really I've structured the talk into 3 sections, and I wanted to address the hype from the outset. If you write a book entitled The 1 Minute Workout, you probably shouldn't be surprised if you see headlines like this. The book's not all about exercising for 1 minute, nor would I advocate that people should only do a few minutes of exercise a week. And I'd like to say from the outset, the public health guidelines are based on tremendous science. And so you'll see a theme through my talk. Often we're setting up silos and adversarial positions, and I don't think it's productive. This is a fantastic commentary by Louise Burke that was published earlier this year in the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. And Louise addresses some of the challenges that I think many of you in the room face today as scientists. I think all of us want to feel that our work makes an impact, and there's a lot of opportunities now for us to share, disseminate findings in non-traditional formats, so not just through journal articles and reviews. And Louise makes this point, and her advice is engage to the best of your ability, whet the reader's appetite, and tackle the larger message. I actually don't tweet that frequently, certainly in comparison to some of my McMaster colleagues. But I would make the point that, headlines like the 1 Minute Workout, yes, in some ways they're attention grabbing, but it provides opportunities like this. And I think it's important to emphasize that, it can provide opportunities to do a Q&A in the New York Times with Gretchen Reynolds. There's time devoted a whole issue to exercise. And you can do podcasts that last 90 minutes with people like Tim Ferriss, who has 1.4 million Twitter followers. And I make this point to say that these opportunities provide context and nuance to the message. So the attention is often given to the headlines, but opportunities like this, I think, provide an expanded opportunity to provide nuance to your message. It's a double-edged sword, of course, so at the other end of the spectrum, you need to worry a little bit. And this is another fantastic commentary. It's been out for a few years now, but Neil Hall coined the term Kardashians to describe individuals that perhaps have an outsized social media presence relative to their number of scientific citations. And he deemed these individuals Kardashians, and so the definition was, once your K-index, or Kardashian index, which is your number of Twitter followers divided by your number of scientific citations, once it gets above 5, maybe it's time to get back into the lab and get off social media. I'm happy to report that currently my K-index is well below 1. The other problem, I think, or potential issue with social media, especially 140 characters in Twitter, is it provides limited opportunity to provide a message. And so again, coming back to this theme of adversarial positions, I think some individuals set up straw man arguments for various reasons where you try to be backed into a corner. And so very specifically, for example, people will talk about sprint interval training and use that as an all-encompassing term for interval training. You'll hear terms like, sprint interval training is bad, no one would do it, as an all-encompassing suggestion that applies to all of interval training. And I don't think that's true, and I think that'll come across hopefully in my talk. Last point is, the more perspectives, the better. I have biases, some of those may come across today, and so I think the more widely read you can be, the more individuals you can follow on Twitter if you're interested in that platform, the more perspectives you can receive, even opposing perspectives, the more informed your own position, I think, will be. Let's get to the meat of the talk, which is really about interval training for health. Let's start with a definition. There is no universal definition. I struggled for a long time to come up with this one, but it's the best I could do. Key point is it's intermittent exercise, typically characterized by repeated bouts of relatively intense effort. Well, what does that mean? We can characterize intensity many different ways relative to maximal heart rate, RPE, percent VO2 max, and it's separated by periods of recovery, but at least to me, those occur within a single training session. And so this would distinguish a session of interval training from, for example, exercise snacking, which is the idea where you may do frequent bouts of exercise spread through the day with long periods in between. So this is my definition. I think it's a fair one. It's not perfect. Now, if we consider typical exercise intensities, this would be, I think, a reasonable interpretation of the current ACSM guidelines where we have demarcation points for moderate, vigorous, and near maximal to maximal exercise. Moderate exercise, vigorous exercise of continuous nature looks like this, pretty straightforward. You get within a zone and you stick there continuously for a period of time. We can make comparisons between the volume of exercise, and so if we were to add up the area under the curve there, this would be 2 bouts of exercise that are obviously different intensities. They're both continuous in nature, but the overall volume in terms of energy expenditure is quite similar. And so this is reflective of the public health guidelines, which advocates 75 minutes of vigorous or 150 minutes of moderate. Now, the public health guidelines do not separate intensity based on potential benefit to suggest that intensity matters, but more related to the fact that the energy expenditure, calories burned with these 2 types of exercise are quite similar. Interval exercise, in contrast, typically looks like one of these 2 areas. They're typically defined as high-intensity interval training or sprint interval training. Now, interval training is infinitely variable. These are just 2 standard types that have come to dominate the literature, and I think they're reasonable. Typically, the definition for HIIT is intensity must be 80% of maximum. That's often defined relative to VO2 max, but it could be percent heart rate reserve or percent maximal heart rate. But you'll typically see around 80%, and I think that's reasonable in the literature. Whereas the other type of exercise here is near maximal or all out. And even in this image here, it's not really doing it justice because obviously absolute workloads can be far above VO2 max. It's possible to sprint at 200% of your VO2 max for short periods of time. As I mentioned, interval training could also look like this. This could be defined as moderate intensity interval training. It's not generally well studied. There was a recent editorial in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that called for more exercise comparisons using a moderate approach, but generally it hasn't been well studied, although I'll point out one study to show that even this type of gentle interval exercise, to my mind, can be very effective. Typically, people are interested in this question: how does interval compare to traditional moderate intensity continuous training? And you'll make comparisons that are matched work. So how does a bout of HIIT that is matched work or energy matched in terms of energy expenditure, how does that compare to moderate intensity continuous training? And I'll spend the bulk of my talk talking about that. We've been more interested in the apples to oranges comparison, and that's how does a relatively small dose of very high intensity exercise characterized by repeated sprints, how does that compare to moderate intensity continuous training? None of this is new, of course. And interval exercise has been practiced by athletes for well over a century. We can probably get into a debate about this, but to my mind, the Finns deserve the credit primarily for introducing it, and they dominated middle distance running for many decades at the turn of the century. The individual on the right is Paavo Nurmi, who won 9 Olympic gold medals, including 5 in the 1924 Games in Paris, including 2 Olympic golds a little more than an hour apart. These individuals trained almost exclusively using very hard intervals. German researchers subsequently performed some scientific studies. This is a professor and coach, Gerschler, working with a cardiologist, Reindl, who were conducting studies of heart function in athletes in the 40s. Of course, Bannister, he broke the mile record in 54, was a very busy medical student who famously trained using intervals on his lunch hour. The Canadian Air Force came up with a program called 5BX, or 5 Basic Exercises, in the late 1950s. And it was designed to get primarily airmen who were stationed in the far north defending Canada's sovereignty against other nations. These people didn't have a lot of incentive to exercise. It's very cold in far north in Canada, and so this program was designed by actually a Canadian hockey player, did his PhD in the US at Illinois. Took 10 minutes a day in order to keep the soldiers in shape, and that program was subsequently widely distributed in Canada. The first English language scientific publications start to appear around the 1960s. My mentor, Bengt Saltine, his first publication was on intermittent exercise. Fox and Matthews, working at Ohio State, published a book called Interval Training based on their research at Ohio State in 1974, in which they deemed interval training the supreme way to condition an athlete, but it was equally applicable to the businessmen. And so even then, this idea that interval training could be used to promote health. Katharina Meyer, an MD working in Germany, in the early 90s did a series of studies applying interval training to cardiac patients, showing that they could exercise quite intensely, and yet the cardiac strain was similar, actually less, than continuous moderate exercise. And of course, Tabata's protocol came out in 1996 in MedSci. Since then, there's been an explosion of interest in interval training to the point where 200 papers a year now are coming out. And of course, it's impossible to do justice to all of those in a short talk today. This has been coinciding with, I think, a general public health interest in interval training that peaked in 2014 when HIIT was named the top worldwide fitness trend. It's sunk a few places since then. I think it's number 3 last year, so perhaps falling, and one could argue maybe I just got this president's lecture just in time because it's going to fall off the list. But I think there's some enduring qualities to it. With 200 papers a year coming out now, it provides some opportunity for systematic reviews, meta-analyses. Here I'm largely going to be citing the work of others. This is not the type of research that I do, but of course meta-analyses can be a very effective tool to try and provide a broad snapshot or overview of an area. I've selected this one, a recent publication in the British Journal of Sports Medicine by Batacan, primarily because, to my mind, it's one of the most comprehensive. They used 65 intervention studies, stratified the results based on BMI and training duration, and this was a wide range of interval training, including acute sprint training studies to HIIT studies that lasted almost a year. If they looked at the data for people training less than 3 months who were normal weight, the main advantage was the improvement in cardiorespiratory fitness. And I think clearly this is the main benefit to high-intensity interval training. Is it's a marked and effective stimulus to enhance cardiorespiratory fitness. You can see in terms of other health-related markers, not much of an effect. Now, if they looked at overweight and obese individuals who trained for a longer period of time, again, strong, robust effect in terms of cardiorespiratory fitness, and also some favorable changes in terms of body composition. Note, not body weight, but favorable changes in body composition, as well as some improvements in blood pressure control. And so the overall conclusion was, because interval training often can be more time efficient than a continuous approach, perhaps it's an effective substitute occasionally, or it might complement the traditional approach. And again, this is an important point. We're not talking about HIIT versus the traditional approach. I think the best exercise for you is the one that you like and enjoy, because you're more likely to stick with it. If interval training provides opportunities to sprinkle into a traditional training program, that's great. A lot of people are interested in that question, though, of how does interval training compare to continuous training? I think the evidence is quite clear that both sprint training and high-intensity interval training can be extremely effective. Sticking with high-intensity interval training, this is a meta-analysis published a few years ago in Sports Medicine, showing that overall it favored high-intensity interval training. This was in young, healthy, middle-aged, and young individuals. Clear benefit to high-intensity interval training in terms of the improvement in cardiorespiratory fitness. I think the message is the same for individuals who have cardiometabolic disease. Ulrich Wisloff, I'm not sure if Ulrich's in the audience, clearly has been a leader in this area, and the work out of Norway has been quite transformative in my opinion. He's working with a number of other individuals now. This is a review that he did with Weston and Jeff Coombs from Australia. Some of this work was presented yesterday. But again, now all of these papers are conducted in individuals with primarily lifestyle-induced cardiometabolic disease. Again, the clear message is that in terms of cardiorespiratory fitness, the benefit from interval compared to continuous training is approximately a doubling. So twice the bang for your buck with intervals compared to continuous. Other reviews and meta-analyses looking specifically at health-related indices. This is one that was conducted by Jellyman and co-workers, comparing intervals to continuous training. Some evidence in both healthy and non-healthy individuals that interval exercise is superior. And this is another recent review from Coombs and co-workers looking specifically at vascular function. Again, the same conclusion that intervals are more effective at, in this case, looking at brachial artery vascular function. Now, you can criticize these reviews in that they tend to be relatively small. We're talking 6, 7 papers typically, usually dominated by one lab, maybe 150 to 200 subjects in total. So they're still relatively small compared to other larger scale systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So that is clearly a limitation. The other point is that not all of the meta-analyses and reviews come to this conclusion. So I've cherry-picked a little bit, but you can certainly find others that would suggest there's no difference. To my mind, I don't see many that suggest interval training are worse. So I think at worst, you can see similar effects with interval and continuous training, suggesting it provides more options, and some evidence at least that when it's work matched, you can see some superior benefits in these other indices of cardiometabolic health. So how does this square with the message that largely was delivered yesterday during the Dill lecture? Obviously, very distinguished presentation, making the point, though, that vigorous exercise can be risky. And this is the recent, most updated guidelines from ACSM, making the point that in particularly in unaccustomed individuals or those not used to exercise, when they do vigorous exercise, their risk is transiently but markedly elevated in terms of an acute myocardial event. And so I think this needs to be taken into context. The conclusion of the review, or one of the points made in the review, is that the hazard of exercise-related events is higher, clearly, if you do vigorous exercise. And so I think right now a conservative approach would be, yes, there is a higher risk with more vigorous exercise, and so the conservative approach would be that no one should do it. But I think there's a lot of evidence coming out, and a lot of these reviews and meta-analyses are suggesting, you know what, when we're actually testing this in the lab, generally we're finding that it's relatively safe for most individuals. Now, I say that as a non-medical doctor, non-cardiologist, and I'm not running an exercise cardiology or clinical laboratory. And so, again, it comes back to different views. People are going to assess the evidence in different ways. I would make the point, though, that for my book, I talked to Paul Thompson, who is one of the authors of this, regarding this whole idea of risk. And Paul made the point, he said, look, if you're 60 years old, you don't know if you have some underlying conditions. Most individuals have an MI without any previous episodes. And so if you're older, if time is not an issue for you, I'd choose moderate. But he made the distinct point that if your choice is doing nothing or doing high-intensity interval training, he would choose high-intensity interval training. And again, if you look at large-scale meta-analyses, even a single weekly bout of high-intensity vigorous exercise is protective in terms of all-cause mortality. Now, that's different at the individual level. And obviously, if you are someone considering exercise, especially if you're not doing any exercise, or you may have some underlying conditions, at the individual level, it's best to get assessed. We're currently doing work on type 2 diabetics. Every single subject coming in goes through an exercise stress test and are screened before they're potentially cleared to engage in our studies. To my mind, the best evidence out there right now that's tried to assess this in an objective manner is data out of Norway. Jeff Coombs talked about these data yesterday if you were at his presentation. But in Norway, interval training has become a usual standard of care, or at least it's routinely applied. I shouldn't say it's usual standard of care. It's routinely applied in cardiac rehabilitation programs. And so this study published in Circulation a few years ago looked at 5,000 individuals, roughly half of whom were doing traditional moderate intensity continuous exercise in a cardiac rehab setting. There was one incident. It was a fatal MI. In the group doing high intensity work, there were 2 incidents, both non-fatal. Now, if you express that relative to the hours engaged in exercise, there's about a 5-fold difference there, 5-fold higher with the intervals, in large part because they spend less time engaged in the exercise. But I think the broad takeaway from this, at least in a highly supervised setting with stable individuals, is that the relative risk is low with both high intensity and moderate exercise. Now, of course, that's very different from individuals just exercising on their own or not in a supervised setting. I would make the point as well that, again, different perspectives, people are going to read the literature differently. These are individuals, including cardiologists working in Canada, who would suggest that given the evidence now, interval training should be more fully and systematically integrated into cardiac rehabilitation programs. And I think if you looked across North America, you're going to see differences. And in Europe, some programs adopt it to a greater extent, and others take a more conservative approach. Final point that I would make on this is not all of the data is in favor of interval training. And this is some of the first data coming out of the SMART-X study, which is a multi-center trial across Europe, looking specifically at individuals with heart failure, and the conclusion was that interval training was no better. So compared to traditional moderate continuous training, at least in terms of left ventricular remodeling, and also aerobic capacity. Now, these are in compromised individuals, no difference, or certainly no benefit with interval training, and so its feasibility remains unsolved, specifically in patients with heart failure. So again, I think if you look at the literature, there's significant evidence in favor of interval training, but not all of it is favorable. It's not a panacea, certainly, for everyone. And so if we were to summarize broadly the adaptations to this point, I think this is a fair summary. Clearly, it's very effective, and you can see large improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness, which, as we've heard repeatedly throughout this meeting, perhaps it's time to call CRF the 5th vital sign. It's clearly very important in terms of your risk for all-cause mortality and developing cardiovascular disease. In terms of other cardiometabolic risk factors and health indices, I think you can see modest improvements depending on the study, certainly, but even depending on the meta-analysis and what specific studies have been including. But I think a fair statement is that generally you can see results that are at least comparable and sometimes greater than traditional continuous exercise. And finally, in terms of risk, again, I would point you to the meta-analyses, read through these, especially the ones that are being done by clinicians in a rehabilitation setting. I think there's mounting evidence to suggest that it's relatively safe. And I use that term cautiously, but clearly there are concerns, and concerns have been expressed about the potential risk and the feasibility, and larger, broader, longer randomized clinical trials are required with large numbers in order to get to the bottom of this. I made the point that not everything is high-intensity interval training. And interval training can be, as I call it, very gentle hills and valleys. This is tremendous work, to my mind, coming out of Denmark. This is a study published a couple of years ago now, but this group is continuing to do work on this, looking at what they call free living interval training, basically interval walking. And so, I often say when I'm doing media interviews, if your only exercise is walking around the block, interval walking is picking up the pace for a few light posts and backing off. And there's evidence to suggest that that's a better approach. This is a small study, but it was a randomized clinical trial in older, obese individuals. By no means was this time-efficient interval exercise. But what they were doing was looking at continuous or interval walking at a very modest intensity, on average 66% of maximal heart rate in both groups, So the interval walkers basically would pick up the pace for about 3 minutes and then back off. So they got about 5 beats faster and then about 5 beats slower. So gentle interval walking. The data are very clear that the interval compared to continuous walking was superior. So this is showing the change in cardiorespiratory fitness. On the right are the interval walkers, the continuous walkers in the middle, and the control group on the far left. Large improvement in cardiorespiratory fitness, no change in the other two groups. They also looked at 24-hour blood sugar using continuous glucose monitoring, where, as you would know, you get a blood sugar reading, interstitial glucose reading, every 5 minutes. And mean 24-hour blood sugar improved in the interval walkers. The continuous walkers basically treaded water, and the control group got worse over the 4 months of training. So the simple takeaway, and again, I think this is a very potent message that could be expressed in a family care physician's office, is that interval walking, there's evidence that it's better. So if your only exercise is walking, good on you, but perhaps you're going to see some greater benefits if you pick up the pace and then back it off a little bit. Now, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. And this has really been our interest. The work out of our lab has looked at very brief, very high intensity exercise. Clearly not for everyone, and I think it's best to characterize these studies as small proof of concept studies. We've been interested in the question, how low can you go? And so this is our most recent and, to my mind, most comprehensive study to date. The essential findings are in the title, but basically we looked at people, studied them for almost 3 months, and we had markedly different exercise protocols. The sprint protocol looks like this, because we wanted something, a protocol, that no one could argue with us was time efficient. And so start to finish, the protocol's 10 minutes in duration. You begin with a 2-minute light warm-up. That could be walking exercise, or it could be light cycling on a bike. You do a 20-second very hard sprint. And when I say hard sprint, we ask people to go all out. It's basically a modified Wingate. 2 minutes of recovery, a second sprint, and then a third and final sprint. So start to finish, 10 minutes with 1 minute of very vigorous interval exercise spread throughout. We compared people who were doing this protocol, so the sprint protocol showing here, the 3 20-second sprints. The workload was all out, so they achieved about 200% of VO2 max, about 500 watts during the sprints. But of course, the recovery periods are very light, 50 watts. The interesting thing, and this is one of the challenges of prescribing interval exercise, we're telling people, get on that bike and pedal as hard as you can. I tell people, like you're pedaling to save your child from an oncoming car or escape from danger pace. And yet, the RPE values on average are 16 out of 20, which are hard. They start out around 12, 14 for the middle one, and 16 for the last one. So even though we're asking people, go as hard as you can, they don't rate it as 20 out of 20 because the exercise is so brief. On average, over the 10 minutes, 83% of maximal heart rate, and this was the total work that they did. The continuous group, 50 minutes of continuous exercise, so 3 times a week they were meeting public health guidelines, about 110 watts, on average an RPE of 13, mean heart rate of 73%, and a much higher overall exercise volume. What did we find? Remarkably similar improvements in the two groups. On the left, we have the moderate intensity continuous group. This is the sprint group in the middle. This is a control group, non-exercise control. This is the change in cardiorespiratory fitness. 19% improvement in both groups on average overall. These are the individual data. So almost a 2-met improvement in 12 weeks, not bad, but remarkably similar despite these dramatic differences in the amount of exercise. I know there was a session earlier today on individual differences. Whether these individual differences just reflect inherent biological variability, whether this person who was a quote-unquote non-responder would have benefited more by following an interval training approach. We don't know, of course, whether this individual would have done better with a moderate approach. We don't know. Obviously, there's inherent differences in individual variability and responsiveness, but the overall mean responses are quite striking to my mind. We also looked at insulin sensitivity. Obviously, this can be measured many different ways. we used an intravenous glucose tolerance test, not the gold standard clamp, excuse me, but a reasonable surrogate. And what we found was improvements in insulin sensitivity in both groups, not statistically different, if anything, a little bit higher in the sprint group. And that was the same when we looked at muscle biopsies and we examined mitochondrial content in the subject's vastus lateralis muscles. Again, you see the variability, but overall, significant improvements with training in the moderate and sprint group to a similar extent, despite these dramatic differences in total exercise volume and time commitment. So the question is why, of course. Certainly as a scientist, as a basic scientist, that's what keeps me interested. What are the mechanisms that can explain this? Many in the audience, of course, are interested in the same question. This is a nice overview schematic from a recent review in Diabetologia from Cassidy and coworkers, where they basically make the point that the cardiometabolic effects from systematic changes, obviously there's lots of systems in the body that are involved, but generally we can group them into changes in skeletal muscle, which as a muscle physiologist has been my main interest, and I'll show some work from our laboratory. But generally we would expect these beneficial changes are owing to improvements in how we handle calcium or glucose primarily, and changes in mitochondrial biogenesis, which increase oxidative capacity. I'm not a cardiovascular physiologist. I have the privilege of working with some colleagues who are, but of course, there's many changes in the cardiovascular system that could be beneficial as well, including things like calcium handling, as well as changes in flow-mediated dilation and other parameters. Generally speaking, I would say that we're more advanced on the muscle side in terms of looking at some of the mechanistic changes, but there's a lot of good work going on the cardiovascular side. In the interest of time, I'll just specifically talk about muscle, and obviously I'm more comfortable speaking about that. Going to this idea of individual differences, it's a problem in training studies, or at least it's a reality. I can train two groups of people differently. They may respond similarly or differently, but I don't really know if that's because of the training or that's because of individual variability. And so we've taken a cue from a model that was developed by some Australian researchers. It involves single-leg cycling. For those who may have done single-leg cycling, it feels very awkward. It doesn't feel like natural cycling. There's a lot of hip flexor involved, but you can largely overcome that in a very simple way by hanging a weight or a counterweight on the opposite pedal. And so what that weight does, it allows the opposite pedal to return to the starting position. It basically does the work, if you will, of the opposite leg. And so within one familiarization ride, this feels very much like natural two-legged cycling, even though you're only working one leg at a time. We basically took a clue from work being done on resistance exercise. It's very common in resistance exercise studies to make comparisons between legs or use nutritional interventions. And the power of the design, of course, is that you're studying changes within the same person. So if you see differential effects, it's not due to individual differences. And so what we've done in a recent study is have individuals come into the laboratory, perform continuous training with one leg, and do interval exercise training with the other leg. They typically train on opposite days, not always. Sometimes it's on the same day. We try as best we can to randomize out for things like dominance and that. We don't try to recruit soccer players, so as much as possible, the individuals don't have a dominant leg, but we try to randomize it out. But as best as possible, it's a within-subject training design. We've done a recent study where individuals train for 2 weeks, and what we find, the interval training group is in dark bars, moderate continuous training in open bars. After 2 weeks of training, there's an overall training-induced improvement in mitochondrial content. This is reflected by the maximal activity of citrate synthase, which is a very good surrogate marker of content. And what you see is that there's a training-induced improvement, but a significantly greater improvement in the leg that does the interval training. This is paralleled by changes in mitochondrial respiration. This is total mass-specific mitochondrial respiration. If you divide out by the change in citrate synthase, you don't see as much of a robust effect, which suggests that this is largely reflecting the change in content. But again, the take-home point is that the interval training results in superior adaptations. So when you have the same individual doing two different types of exercise, interval and continuous training, we see that interval exercise elicits superior adaptations despite equal total work. And so what this suggests is that either intensity per se, or possibly the contraction pattern, this idea of the on-off pattern, is important. This is the dreaded pathway slide, as Lawrence Spreet likes to say. This is just an overview of some of the pathways or signaling changes that happen inside skeletal muscle. When we contract our muscle, we generate signals, and so if you just focus in the middle here, lots of potential candidate molecules, of course, including changes in energy state, changes in calcium, changes in lactate, changes in hydrogen ions. All of these are potential candidate signaling molecules that might be involved in a differential response between interval and continuous exercise. These, of course, converge on specific signaling kinases, AMP activated protein kinase, of course, being one in particular that, of course, can activate PGC1 alpha, a critical transcriptional coactivator that leads to mitochondrial biogenesis. Lots of good work down at the cellular level trying to resolve this. But just very briefly, I'll show two pieces of evidence specifically focusing on AMPK. This is work out of Denmark. What this study, I think, specifically contributed is they looked at fiber type specific regulation of some of these signaling kinases, because of course there's lots of hand waving around the fact that interval exercise probably recruits a greater proportion of type 2 or fast twitch muscle fibers, and so perhaps part of the adaptive response is owing to the fact that you call upon or recruit these type 2 muscle fibers. There's not a ton of evidence out there because it's difficult to do single fiber or at least pooled fiber studies. What they did in this study was just that, and so they had individuals. This is a repeated measures design, so on one day the subjects did continuous exercise at 70%. On the other day, they did work-matched intervals, including exercise at 95%. What this figure is showing are the changes in continuous exercise and with interval exercise at rest and after exercise. So this is acute exercise bouts in type 1 fibers shown in open bars and type 2 muscle fibers in dark bars. The take-home point is that in the subject, or when the subjects did interval exercise in type 2 muscle fibers, they saw greater phosphorylation, which suggests greater activation of AMPK. And so the hypothesis was that perhaps the increased activation of AMPK with interval compared to continuous exercise might be important for these exercise-specific adaptations. I made the point, though, that it might just be the on-off nature of the intermittent exercise pattern. This is another group that was looking at a number of these signaling kinases as well. I'll just show the AMPK data here, but again, repeated measures design where they had subjects do continuous or interval exercise at the same absolute work intensity. So obviously the interval exercise is a bit longer here because there's rest periods. You can't control everything, something's got to change. But the interesting point here is that it was intensity matched, and so they're only really changing the pattern of contraction. And what they found was, even though the overall intensity was matched, the interval exercise resulted in greater activation of AMPK. So this is before training, right after exercise, 3 hours of recovery, the interval group in dark bars showing that the activation, or the phosphorylation at least, of AMPK was greater. And so the suggestion is maybe it's these fluctuations, this repeated on-off pattern. You can make some hypotheses around calcium fluxes and energy fluxes. Those changing, more changes add up or sum up over time, and that might be critical for the adaptation. Last part of the talk. To end, the hope, or to my mind, where do we need to go? What are the unanswered questions? Where does the field need to move? To my mind, there's three big areas. The first is some translational evidence. It's fine to do these very controlled studies in a laboratory setting. What does it mean in the real world? So efficacy versus effectiveness studies, we need to move in that direction. Secondly, do people die less if they do interval training? larger, longer RCTs with endpoint outcomes, including mortality, risk of developing cardiovascular disease. We have this evidence for the most part for the traditional approach as reflected in the public health guidelines. I'm often asked, why don't we see intervals in the public health guidelines? It was interesting for my book. I spoke to Aimin Lee at Harvard University, MD, PhD, epidemiologist, an individual who's involved in writing the public health guidelines. And her response was interesting. On the one hand, she said, intervals, they fit within the public health guidelines. And I said, well, do you just count the hard exercise or the recovery periods? And she said, I count the recovery periods as well. And so if you go and play ice hockey for an hour, even though you might only be on the ice 1/3 of the time, typically there's 3 shifts, that would count as an hour of physical activity. And so her position was that intervals already fit within the public health guidelines, and you count the recovery periods as well as the hard exercise. But maybe we're going to get to a point where we say you do 150 moderate, 75 vigorous, or whatever, 30 minutes of very intense vigorous, but we're not close to that right now, and I understand the reasons why. And the last is, does it matter? Will people do it? And this goes to behavior. I'd just like to make the point on the translational. There is some evidence that you can take this out of the laboratory. This is work from Wisloff's lab again, where they were looking at home-based interval training or a lab-based or traditional cardiac rehabilitation setting. So basically saying, can people do this on their own? I think there's a notion that interval training, it's super complicated, it's really hard, especially older individuals, they don't really get it. And what the outcome of this study was, no evidence for a differential effect. So it would suggest that individuals, if they're properly told how to do interval training, they can do it on their own. And the evidence here suggested a similar effective treatment by both home-based as well as in an organized cardiac rehab setting. We've been interested in taking interval training out of the lab. This is now a sprint training approach. Very simple study, again, really proof of concept work. But we said, well, rather than doing work on a cyclergometer in the lab, what if we just had people climb 3 or 4 flights of stairs? And so you wouldn't believe the ethics involved, or I'm sure the administrators in the room would appreciate the ethics of asking to go to the business building on campus and run up 5 or 4 flights of stairs. It took about 3 months, including health and safety and the business dean signing off on it. But finally, we got it through ethics, and we had people do it. And what we did was, rather than do 3 20-second bursts of cycling, we said 3 20-second sprints on the stairs with just walking recovery or slowly descending the stairs. And we instructed people climb the stairs as fast and as safely as possible. If they wanted to use the handrails, they could. And again, even though we were asking them to go very hard, the mean RPE was 15 out of 20. What we found was basically a very similar result to what we see with cycling. So this is 6 weeks of stair climbing, the improvement in cardiorespiratory fitness. This is what we've previously showed with a modified Wingate approach, basically a 1 MET change in 6 weeks. And I would remind you that based on the epidemiological evidence, individuals with a 1 MET higher cardiorespiratory fitness, 13% lower risk of dying, and in terms of typical numbers that are measured in a physician's office, 7-centimeter change in waist circumference, 5-point change in blood pressure, or a 1 millimolar change in plasma glucose. Again, talking to the converted here in terms of the importance of cardiorespiratory fitness, but quite striking that you can do some sprints on some stairs a few times a week and see these large beneficial changes. Mortality, we need these data. Wisloff, again, leading the way. This is an RCT that basically invited everyone, residents of Trondheim, Norway, who are older, to participate in an exercise study. This is going to be a 5-year randomized clinical trial where they've now randomized over 1,500 individuals to exercise or control. And importantly, they're going to study moderate intensity continuous exercise or the 4x4 minute model that's been utilized extensively in Norway, high intensity interval training, and looking what happens with a total of 5 years of follow-up. And so it's really the first study, I think, to look at the long term, at least in terms of 5-year follow-up, but they plan to actually go out farther beyond that, but officially a 5-year follow-up, looking at the effect of both high intensity and moderate intensity exercise on how people age as well as, of course, risk of dying. It's hard to motivate people to do things. I'm not a behavioral expert, and I'll say that right from the outset. I think it's important, though, that we start to address psychosocial affective responses to interval exercise. How does it compare to continuous exercise? If I could frame the issue as a non-specialist, my sense is there's largely two schools of thought. What I would say is the traditional school of thought is interval exercise will fail as a public health message because it's hard in nature, it's above ventilatory threshold, it's an uncomfortable form of training, and so people won't do it. I think there's another group of health and exercise psychologists now who would say, well, wait a minute, continuous vigorous exercise is very different from intermittent vigorous exercise, and people might be willing to do intermittent exercise. This is the results, a review article based on a debate that took place a few years ago, where the authors said, look, from the physiological benefits we agree, but otherwise we don't agree at all in terms of the potential impact on public health. Again, I appreciate why in a debate format you might set it up as this adversarial position, but I think there's diminishing returns to that. This is a great study, or great commentary, I would say, from Mary Jung and co-workers, basically commenting on a study or a paper that appeared saying, again, I would say framing interval exercise as only sprint training, suggesting that it's not going to work for a largely sedentary population. This is a great paragraph where they said, can't we all just get along a little better here? Maybe not all of these positions, adversarial positions, and they said for whatever reason, there's a disciplinary rivalry here. And interval training really shines through in academic writing. It's rarely mentioned without some sort of real emotional reference in the exercise psychology literature. And so the very reasonable suggestion, I think, was that rather than disputing and basically having, we don't think this will happen, let's argue with evidence. And so they called on physiologists, psychologists to really work together on interdisciplinary research that will allow for a fair evaluation of the two modalities. We're trying to do that, right? And others in the room are as well. This just appeared this week. It's a scoping review that I had the privilege of working on with a number of exercise psychologists, some colleagues at McMaster and some who've moved to other institutions now. And I'd encourage you to look at this. One of the conclusions was this. So the acute affective responses are similar or more negative during interval exercise compared to continuous. But after exercise, things like enjoyment, preference for interval exercise are equal to or greater. So what that means to a physiologist, I think, is it basically depends when, how, and what question you ask people. If you ask them how do they feel during it, they might say, you know what, this hurts a little bit more. But you ask them afterwards and they say, you know what, that wasn't so bad. I can do that again, and I actually like that on-off approach. And so the conclusion is that interval exercise, it might not be ideal or preferred for all, but it may be a viable option for many. So perhaps more menu choices, right? Other individuals use more tools in the toolbox. Whatever your analogy is, that I think is the ideal that we're all working towards. And to make that point, if you were in room 110 right now, you'd hear Michelle Seeger speaking on really an opposite message to me, you would think, based on the title of her talk. Michelle's written a book called No Sweat, which is really about getting people, just motivating them to do something. And so you might say, pretty adversarial positions, but the more Michelle and I spoke, we had more in common than we had in terms of against one another, to the point where we thought, you know what, let's have a discussion about this after. And so if you're interested in continuing the discussion, Gretchen Reynolds from the New York Times is going to moderate a little session starting at 12:30 in Michelle's room 110 right after this. So if I could leave you with a few take-home points, to my mind, interval exercise, it's efficient. Yes, there's some time efficiency. So what I mean by that, you can do less of it and see similar benefits, or do the same as moderate approach and see greater gains, especially when it comes to cardiorespiratory fitness. I think the basic work that can be done, there's lots. It's an intriguing model to look at mechanisms regarding systematic remodeling, including effects on brain health, for example, brain remodeling, and some are working on that. And finally, it's an almost infinite variable form of exercise. Nothing wrong with the traditional approach, only so many ways you can jump on a treadmill and run at a moderate pace for 45 minutes or an hour. With intervals, almost infinite variety. So that's the thought that I'd like to leave you with. I would like to thank again ACSM for the opportunity to be here. This is my current group. Some of my colleagues from McMaster are here. I appreciate that. Mark Tarnopolsky, my main clinical colleague who facilitates much of my invasive research, key trainees who've worked on this, Burgomaster, Little, Gillen, and Martin McInnes, and the agencies that have funded our work. Thank you.